All right, guys, starting a new book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome, written by historian Michael Parenti. This book was actually referred to me or introduced to me by a history teacher, history professor. So here we go. Chapter 1, Gentleman's History, Empire, Class, and Patriarchy. So each chapter starts with a quote from Julius Caesar, written by Shakespeare. So, Rome, thou hast lost the breed of noble bloods. Here we go. The writing of history has long been a privileged calling, undertaken within the church, royal court, landed estate, affluent townhouse, government agency, university, and corporate-funded foundation. The social and ideological context in which historians labor greatly influences the kind of history produced. While this does not tell us everything there is to know about historiography, it is certainly worth some attention. Historians are fond of saying, as did Benedetto Grossi, that history reflects the age in which it is written. The history of seemingly remote events vibrate to present needs and present situations. Collingwood made a similar point. St. Augustine looked at Roman history from the point of view of an early Christian. Tillemont from that of a 17th century Frenchman, Gibbon from that of an 18th century Englishman. Something is left unsaid here, for there is no unanimity in how the people of any epoch view the past, let alone the events of their own day. The differences in perception range not only across the ages and between civilizations, but within any one society at any one time. Gibbon was not just an 18th century Englishman, but an 18th century English gentleman. In his own words, a youth of family and fortune, enjoying the luxury and freedom of a wealthy house. As heir to a considerable estate, he attended Oxford, where he wore the velvet cap and silk gown of a gentleman. While serving as an officer in the militia, he soared in the company of rustic officers who were alike deficient in the knowledge of scholars and the manners of gentlemen. To say that Gibbon and his Oxford peers were gentlemen is not to imply that they were graciously practiced in the etiquette of fair play toward all persons regardless of social standing, or that they were endowed with compassion for the more vulnerable of their fellow humans, taking pains to save them from hurtful indignities as real gentlemen might do. If anything, they were likely to be unencumbered by such sentiments, uncomprehending of any social need beyond their own select circle. For them, a gentleman was one who spotted an uncommonly polished manner and affluent lifestyle, and who presented himself as prosperous, politically conservative, and properly schooled in the art of ethnoclass supremacism. Like most other people, Gibbon tended to perceive reality in accordance with the position he occupied in the social structure. As a gentleman scholar, he produced what elsewhere I have called gentleman's history, a genre heavily indebted to an upper-class ideological perspective. In 1773, we find him beginning work on his magnus opus, a history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, while settled in a comfortable townhouse tended by half a dozen servants. Being immersed in what he called the decent luxuries and saturated with his own upper-class prepossession, Edward Gibbon was able to look kindly upon ancient Rome's violently acquisitive aristocracy. He might have produced a much different history had he been a self-educated cobbler sitting in a cold shed, writing into the wee hours after a long day of unrewarding toil. No accident that the impoverished laborer, even if literate, seldom had the agency to produce scholarly tomes. Gibbon himself was aware of the class realities behind the writing of history. A gentleman possessed of leisure and independence of books and talents may be encouraged to write by the distant prospect of honor and reward, but wretched is the author, and wretched will be the work where daily diligence is stimulated by daily hunger. As one who hobnobled with nobility, As one who hobnobbed with the nobility, Gibbon abhorred the wild theories of equal and boundless freedom of the French Revolution. He was a firm supporter of the British Empire. While serving as a member of Parliament, he voted against extending liberties to the American colonies. Unsurprisingly, he had no difficulty conjuring a glowing pastoral image of the Roman Empire. Domestic peace and union were the natural consequences of the moderate and comprehensive policy embraced by the Romans. The obedience of the Roman world was uniform, voluntary, and permanent. The vanquished nations, blended into one great people, resigned the hope, nay, even the wish of resuming their independence. The vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. Not a word here about an empire built upon sacked towns, shattered armies, slaughtered villagers, raped women, enslaved prisoners, plundered lands, burned crops, and mercilessly overtaxed populations. The gentlemen historians who lived during antiquity painted much the same idyllic picture, especially of Rome's earlier epoch. The theme they repeatedly visited was of olden times as golden times, when men were more given to duty than luxury. Women were chaste and unsparingly devoted to their family patriarchs. Youth were ever respectful of their elders, and the common people were modest in their expectations and served valiantly in Rome's army. Writing during the late Republic, Sallust offers his fairy tale of Roman times earlier than his own. In peace and war, virtus, valor, manliness, virtue was held in high esteem, and avarice was a thing almost unknown. Justice and righteousness were upheld not so much by law as by natural instinct. They governed by conferring benefits on their subjects, not by intimidation. A more realistic picture of Roman imperialism comes from some of its victims. In the 1st century BC, King Mithridates, driven from his land in northern Anatolia, wrote, "The Romans have constantly had the same cause, a cause of the greatest antiquity, for making war upon all nations, peoples, and kings, the insatiable desire for empire and wealth." Likewise, the Caledonian chief Calgacus, speaking toward the end of the 1st century AD, observed, "You find in the Romans an arrogance which no reasonable submission can elude. Brigands of the world, they have exhausted the land by their indiscriminate plunder, and now they ransack the sea. The wealth of any enemy excites their cupidity, his poverty their lust of power. Robbery, butchery, rapine, the liars call empire. They create a desolation and call it peace. Our loved ones are now being torn from us by conscription to slave in other lands. Our wives and sisters, even if they are not raped by enemy soldiers, are seduced by men who are supposed to be our friends and guests. Our goods and our money are consumed by taxation. Our land is stripped of its harvest to fill their granaries. Our hands and limbs are crippled by building roads through forests and swamps under the lash of our oppressors. We Britons are sold into slavery anew every day. We have to pay the purchase price ourselves and feed our masters in addition." For centuries, written history was considered a patrician literary genre, much like epic and tragedy, concerned with the monumental deeds of great personages, a world in which ordinary men play no role other than nameless spear carriers, and ordinary women not even that. Antiquity gives us numerous gentlemen chroniclers: Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Cicero, Livy, Plutarch, Suetonius, Appian, Dio Cassius, Valerius Maximus, Valerius Paterculus, Josephus, and Tacitus. Antiquity gives us numerous gentlemen chroniclers. Homer. Just about all of whom had a pronouncedly low opinion of the common people. Dio Cassius, for one, assures us that many monarchs are the source of blessings to their subjects, whereas many who live under a democracy work innumerable evils to themselves. I don't know if Homer wrote anything more than Odysseus or the Iliad, but how could this author include Homer? Maybe because I'm a fan of Homer and what he wrote, but I disagree until I do my further research. So Dio Cassius, for one, assures us that many monarchs are the source of blessings to their subjects, whereas many who live under a democracy work innumerable evils to themselves. The political biases of ancient historians were not interred with their bones. Our historical perceptions are shaped not only by our present socioeconomic status, but by the ideological and class biases of the past historians upon whom we rely. As John Gauger notes, it is difficult to alter our habitual ways of thinking about history because without knowing it, we perceive the past according to paradigms first created many centuries ago, and the creators of those ancient paradigms usually spoke with decidedly upper-class accents. In sum, Gibbon's view of history was not only that of an 18th century English gentleman, but of a whole line of gentlemen historians from bygone times, similarly situated in the upper strata of their respective societies. What would have made it so difficult for Gibbon to gain a critical perspective of his own ideological limitations, had he ever thought of doing so, was the fact that he kept intellectual company with like-minded scholars of yore, and that centuries-old unanimity of bias that is often mistaken for objectivity. To be sure, there were some few observers in ancient Rome, such as the satirist Juvenal, who offered a glimpse of the empire as it really was, a system of rapacious expropriation. Addressing the proconsuls, Juvenal says, "When at last you leave to go out to govern your province, limit your anger and greed. Pity our destitute allies whose poor bones you see sucked dry of their pith and their marrow." In 1919, noted conservative economist Joseph Schumpeter presented a surprisingly critical picture of Roman imperialism in words that might sound familiar to present-day critics of U.S. globalism. That policy which pretends to aspire to peace but unerringly generates war, the policy of continual preparation for war, the policy of meddlesome interventionism. There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies, and if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then was the national honor that had been insulted? The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always fighting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. So Juvenal. Still, the Roman Empire has its 20th century apologist. British historian Cyril Robinson tenders a familiar image of an empire achieved stochastically, without deliberate design. It was perhaps almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain that she acquired her world dominion in a fit of absence of mind. An imperialism without imperialists, a design of conquest devoid of human agency or forethought, such a notion applies neither to Rome nor to any other empire in history. Despite their common class perspective, gentlemen historians do not achieve perfect accord on all issues. Gibbon himself was roundly condemned for his comments about early Christianity in the Roman Empire. He was attacked as an atheist by clergy and others who believed that the religion had flourished exclusively through divine agency and in a morally flawless manner. Gibbon credits Christianity's divine origin as being the primary impetus for its triumph, but he gives only a sentence or two to that notion, being more interested as a secular historian in the natural rather than the supernatural causes of the church's triumph. Furthermore, he does not hesitate to point out instances of worldly opportunism and fanatical intolerance among Christian proselytes. Some readers may find his treatment of the rise of Christianity to be not only the most controversial part of his work, but also the most interesting. Along with his class hauteur, the gentleman scholar is likely to be a male supremacist. So Gibbon describes Emperor Severus' second wife, Julia Domna, as united to a lively imagination, a firmness of mind, and strength of judgment, seldom bestowed on her sex. Historians do take note of the more notorious female perpetrators in the imperial family, such as Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, and Agrippina. Give me a second, hold on. Emperor Severus' second wife. Okay, they tell us that Agrippina grabbed the throne for her son Nero by poisoning her uncle and then her husband, the reigning Claudius. Upon becoming emperor, Nero showed his gratitude to his mother by killing her. Nero was not what we would call a family man. He also murdered his aunt, his ex-wife, and a half-brother who had a claim to the throne. So Agrippina grabbed the throne for her son Nero by poisoning her uncle and then her husband, the reigning Claudius. Upon becoming emperor, Nero showed his gratitude to his mother by killing her, so he's being sarcastic. Nero was not what we would call a family man. He also murdered his aunt, his ex-wife, half-brother. Except for a few high-placed and notably lethal females, Roman women are virtually invisible in the works of most gentlemen historians. Even when noticed, they are not likely to be seen as of any consequence. That there were no female historians to speak of in antiquity, nor for many centuries thereafter, only compounded the deficiency. In the last few decades, thanks mostly to the emergence of feminist scholarship, the research on Roman women has improved, despite the paucity of surviving data. Ordinary Roman women, we know, tended to die younger than their male counterparts because of malnourishment, mistreatment, exhaustion, and childbirth. Almost half of all Roman brides were under the age of 14, many as young as 12, with consummation coming at the time of marriage, even if before monarchy. Women of all ages almost invariably lived under the rule of some male, be it husband, guardian, or paterfamilias, head of the extended family or clan. Through much of Roman history, females were denied individually given names as well as surnames. Prominent gens, names such as Claudius, Julius, and Lucretius, gave forth the obligatory feminine derivatives of Claudia, Julia, and Lucretia. Sisters therefore all had the same name and were distinguished from each other by adding the elder or the younger or the first, the second, and the third. Thus, Gaius Octavius's daughter were Octavia and the elder, and Octavia the younger. So Octavia the elder and Octavia the younger. Denying them an individually named identity was one way of treating females as family property, mere fractional derivatives of the paterfamilias. Women of common case performed much of the onerous work of society as laundresses, domestic servants, millers, weavers, spinners, and sometimes even construction workers, all in addition to their quotidian household chores. As far as we know, even when they labored in the same occupations as men, they were not permitted to belong to craft guilds. Bereft of opportunities for decent livelihood, some of the more impecunious females were driven to selling their sexual favors. Prostitution was given standing as an employment and taxed as such. Owning a brothel was considered a respectable venture by some investors. In general, the great mass of poor women had little hope of exercising an influence on political issues, though numbers of them must have participated in public protests. The devoted, self-sacrificing wife was a prized character in Roman writing. Examples abound of matrons who faced exile or risked death to stand fast with their husbands, but Roman matrons could also be rebellious on occasion. As early as 195 BC, they successfully pressured the magistrates to repeal the Lex Oppia, a law passed during the austerity of the Second Punic War restricting the use of personal ornaments and carriages by women. That they would mobilize themselves in this willful manner sorely vexed many a patriarch. By the late Republic, approximately between 80 and 40 BC, and during the first century of the empire, Roman matrons made a number of important gains relating to marriage, divorce, property rights, and personal independence. Some of them even owned substantial property and administered commercial operations. During the civil strife following Caesar's death, the second triumvirate posted a list of 1,400 particularly wealthy women whose property was to be assessed. The women organized a protest in the forum before the magistrates' tribunal and demanded to know why they had to share in the punishment of the Civil War when they had not collaborated in the crime. Why should we be taxed when we have no share in magistrates? Why should we be taxed when we have no share in magistracies or honors or military commands or in public affairs at all, where your conflicts have brought us to this terrible state? Whatever influence women exercised in business affairs, they never gained full civil rights, nor could they sustain much visibility on the political landscape. Upper-class wives had the reputation of being overly generous with their sexual favors. Sallust clucks about the women who publicly sold their chastity. Horace fumes about the matron who becomes well-practiced in lewd loves, that seeks younger adulterers while their husbands at wine. Writing early in the 2nd century A.D., Juvenal seems to anticipate the venomous misogyny that would soon pour from the pens of the Christian church fathers. Roman matrons, he tells us, are wanton hussies engaged in their illicit pursuits at the expense of the hapless cuckolds who are their husbands. They have long discarded the virtuous devotions of their forebears along with the naturally feminine traits of modesty, chastity, and domestic servitude. In like fashion, a historian from our own era registers his disapproval of the growing sway exercised by high-placed and provident women in the late Republic whose unwholesome influence engendered a growing license and did much to debase the moral and social standards of the day. In truth, Roman matrons were doubtless no more promiscuous than their husbands, whose own commonplace dalliances were largely overlooked given the double standard of that day. Under the patriarchal system, a man was free to kill an allegedly unfaithful wife while himself patronizing prostitutes or keeping a concubine. The codes against adultery initiated by Emperor Augustus were aimed at wives with no prohibitions imposed upon husbands. One of the many Roman writers who see only virtue in Rome's earliest epoch and decadence in their own times is Valerius Maximus. He approvingly cites examples of husbands of yore who divorced their wives or otherwise treated them severely for acting in what we might consider mildly independent ways, such as walking abroad with head uncovered, talking to a common freedwoman, or attending public games without the husband's knowledge. While women were thus checked in the old days, their minds stayed away from wrongdoing. Valerius assures us, powerful men such as Julius Caesar often treated women from well-placed families as disposable strategic assets to be bartered in arranged marriages designed to fortify one's fortune or help forge political coalitions, a practice that continued within European aristocratic circles down through the ages. Women were also a source of sensual divertisement for Caesar as for most other Roman men. A few, such as his first wife Cornelia, his longtime mistress Servilia, and in his last years Cleopatra, did win Caesar's love, though none could ever claim exclusive command of his sexual attentions. Many Roman husbands were hopeless philanderers who fixed upon loveless marriages to advance their careers, pocket ample dowries, or simply enjoy a convenient concupiscence. Still, there were instances of deep conjugal links being forged. Valerius gives several examples of husbands who were stricken at the loss of their wives. So does a younger Pliny, who himself expressed genuine love for his wife. Along with their gender bias, some gentleman historians let slip a noticeable ethno-class bigotry. The progenitor of all historians of the late Republic is Cicero, hailed by Balsan as perhaps the most civilized man who has ever lived. Cicero has been revered by classic professors and Latin teachers throughout the ages. This most civilized man was not above stoking the crassest ethno-prejudices. Cicero sneered at the Greeks and Jews, both the slaves and freedmen among them, who rallied to the side of democratic leaders, declaring that men of those nations often throw our assemblies into confusion. The Greeks are given to shameless lying, the Jews to barbaric superstition. Some latter-day historians have taken their cue from Cicero. Theodore Mommsen describes the Roman Forum as a shouting fest for everyone in the shape of a man, with Egyptians, Jews, and Greeks, both freedmen and slaves, being the loudest participants in the public assemblies. Cyril Robinson notes that many proletarians were of Greek or Oriental origin, whose loose and feeble character made them bad citizens. The purity of Roman blood began to be contaminated by the admixture of this alien element. Those of Oriental blood were incapable of assimilating the national habits of decency and restraint, although not all Greeks, of course, were vicious or unwholesome characters. That's Cicero saying this. JFC Fuller tells us that Rome's Latin stock was increasingly mongrelized as Greeks, Asiatics, Spaniards, Gauls, and other slaves were absorbed through manumission and became citizens. Another esteemed classicist, Jerome Carcopino, flirts with a racist blood theory of history, writing that interbreeding between Roman aristocrats and their female slaves or freed women, followed by frequent emancipation or adoption of the offspring, left many of the best families of the city infected with an actual hybridization similar to that which has more recently contaminated other slave-owning peoples. This mixed breeding strongly accentuated the national and social decomposition of Rome. In ancient Rome, as in societies before and since, class oppression was supported by class bias. The lowly were considered low because of deficiencies within themselves. Class bias, in turn, was often buttressed by ethnic prejudice. Many of the poor, both slaves and free, were from barbarian stock, and this further fueled the tendency to loathe them as wastrels and brigands, troublesome contaminants of respectable society. So ethnic and class bias conveniently dovetailed for those who looked at their world Dahat and Boss, and this included not only the likes of Cicero, but many of the writers who came after him. All right, that's the end of the first chapter. So he's talking a lot about Gibbon. I think he's talking a lot about Gibbon because Gibbon in English, I think he probably wrote, before Michael Parenti wrote this, Gibbon wrote a book, The Rise and Fall and the Decline of the Roman Empire. I actually was going to read that before, but I so happened to walk into a classroom and I asked the teacher what class is. He said it was history. I told him, do you have a book you could refer me to about history? And I told him I'm going to read the Rise and Fall and the Decline of the Roman Empire. And as I was walking away, he said, you should read the Assassination of Julius Caesar. And it's funny, Gibbon is the author I was going to read before I read this about the Roman Empire. And Michael Parenti is pretty much saying, like, you know, Gibbon comes from he's writing from a point of view of, you know, kind of agreeing more with the upper class, just, you know, like the upper class of Julius Caesar, the upper class of the Greeks and the Romans. So how could he really speak truth or speak to what was really going on when he's speaking from a more positive point of view of the Roman Empire and the Julius Caesar reign, etc. So very interesting. I'm kind of glad I read this one. I'm going to read this one first. The reason why I'm going to read it and I'm going to post it is because this book is really not that long. The one Gibbon wrote is very long. This one has big words and it shouldn't take that long for me to actually finish this series. He's kind of speaking in a feminist manner. Not his voice or his tone of writing is feminist. I'm saying he seems to be he's saying he started off defending women in this first chapter. I wonder if he's going to continue doing that. I'm interested. Or did he do that to get it out the way? I mean, I want the whole truth. When I read a book, I want to get the history from what it's supposed to be. And it was surprising. He was just very talking about, you know, prostitution, the way women were treated, not having rights, not being able to you know, have a life for themselves, not even able to have a name, their own name. Like if she had a sister, her name would have to be, oh, this is Mary, the older sister, Mary, the younger sister. Which is crazy. And he came out pretty aggressive, you know, attacking Gibbon, attacking other authors, which is very interesting to his approach to this book. But I like it. It's very simple. And I mean, this is the assassination of Julius Caesar, so yeah, interesting.